2, 1. And we are live. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Wolf. It's good to see all of you. Really excited to be here today. I'm joined by Ray, Buckton, and Vinay Gupta. These are two of our kind of like our talisman from the RWA tokenization side of Wolf. We've been running these shows for like a year and a half or something like that with Ray. Vinay's been one of the OG speakers there. Definitely remember from the beginning. That's back when I lived in Washington, like different part of my life. And Vinay was still there, Ray was still there. And really, really excited to come together here and talk about tokenization, talk about Ethereum a little bit. Vinay wrote a great paper a few years ago, programmable blockchains kind of in context here. And we're going to be discussing all sorts of stuff, but kind of a cool invitation to sort of think of blockchains as like a programmable financial infrastructure. And there's all sorts of ways that we can talk about these things and broaden them out a little bit here into a broader ecosystem, kind of programmable money, automated logic, as well as new asset classes, evolving governance needs, like whatever people want. And whatever people think that may be a use case for Ethereum to fill, there was actually some really, really interesting stuff that Vinay talked about. And so hopefully we're going to be able to dive into that a little bit here with Ray and Vinay. And I'm sure they're going to go in all sorts of different directions in the world of blockchain tokenization. So I'll turn it over to the two experts and we'll go from there. So I'm really excited to get into it. Please do retweet the stream if you haven't already and follow these two gentlemen. They're tagged in the title. And yeah, excited to get into it. Ray, how's it going, man?
Going fantastic, Kate. Always a pleasure. Always love rocking and rolling with the Wolf crew. You guys get to see my face this time. I used to have a big beard. Now I do not. But one thing I still do have is tons of tokenization knowledge. Not as much as the resident guru and expert here, Vinay. Vinay's been here since the beginning of Ethereum. Man's been talking asset tokenization since, before I even knew what a blockchain was. So super excited to be here on the 10th anniversary of the Ethereum network. Vinay, how are we doing today, my friend?
Hey, well, I mean, as usual, overworked, underpaid, right?
The perpetual human condition, isn't it?
Perpetual human condition, that's the one. But yeah, I mean, this has been a real boom year for us because of all the changes in the regulatory status in the States. Suddenly everybody is able to do all the things that they always thought they were going to do with Ethereum. We're kind of at that crossing point of like, oh, this is going from like, yeah, one day to now, because the SEC is kind of being pushed out of the way and we're beginning to get down to a kind of situation where you can actually do the stuff that the technology allows you to, because the law, after only 10 years, is kind of catching up.
100%. It only took a decade. And so I'm personally super excited being at this like 10-year precipice for the world's largest smart contract network. And I know you were there project managing the launch at the beginning. So could we just talk briefly over kind of the core problems at the beginning that you believed Ethereum was being built to solve? I'm really curious as to your perspective there.
So the consensus inside of the foundation, I would say, was best represented by a video that Gavin Wood did most of the script work for and most of the visual design for, which was called Ethereum, the World Computer. You can still find it on the foundation's YouTube channel, 90 seconds long, and it's got the old school kind of gray, white, kind of network diagrams moving through the air kind of a thing. It's like it's a real sort of apex of the old school Ethereum look. And that video, it's like, Ethereum, you're going to use it for financing hospitals, forests, airplanes, trucks. It's all physical assets. There's no non-physical tokenization in that story. Everything basically points towards it's going to be used for financing physical assets of all different kinds. And that was the pitch. That's what we thought we were building. And I still remember the sort of excitement was very much like all of the internal narrative was real world asset. It wasn't that it was some kind of weird esoteric separate domain. It was, this is going to make financing physical stuff much more efficient than it is now. That was what we were all thinking. That's where we were. That's what we thought it was.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And so that didn't quite evolve in the short term following the launch as maybe you thought it would. And I'm really interested. So you have this phenomenal article out, Vinay, from 2015. It's Programmable Blockchains in Context, 2015 to 2016. And you talked about a 40-year deep hole of database connectivity. How do you see that kind of playing out a decade later? Did Ethereum really fulfill on that connectivity promise at least?
No, cold hard fail. So let's talk about the kind of theoretical model. This was a piece that I wrote the morning of the Genesis block, right? So before going into the office, I got up early and I'm like, I should write like a blog post about this. we could stick it up on the Foundation blog. We should just do this. So I sit down and I write something, and it turns out to be about 3 times longer than I expected it to be. And it was an attempt to tell the story of the future. Like, here's where we're going, right? And it was a riff because, I mean, you got to remember that I was mid-40s when the Genesis block was launched 10 years ago. So I would have been 43. I'd crypto experience going back into the mid-1990s. So I'd been doing cryptographic applications engineering when I was like 24, 25, mid-90s. My first year being paid 100% in digital cash was 1999. And that was gold-backed digital currency. So there was a gold vault, and they were issuing tokens off the back of that gold vault. I was being paid in these things. So, for me, when I came to Ethereum, I was already 20 years into crypto. Bitcoin to me was like this, oh, finally somebody's done something interesting with crypto. Wow. But I mean, already then, I'd more than 10 years of crypto by the time of Bitcoin. So that piece was basically intended to kind of say, look, this is where cryptography's been for decades. This is where the real world is jammed when it comes to using computers. What does it look like for the blockchain to basically solve the platform level problems in how computers and society work together? Like, all these things that you see computers doing that annoy you, that don't work properly, all of those are technical problems that show up as social problems. If we solve the technical problems, we will solve the social problems that go with them. This is how Ethereum is going to fix that. And one of the core claims was that we were going to be able to fix the way that large organizations work together by using the blockchain. And I would say that has more or less completely failed. I think that was not what the market wanted. And as a result, almost all the consortium chains kind of failed, and we never saw the explosion of B2B transaction networks on the chain. Now, was that a technical problem? Was that a regulatory problem? But like, the airline industry doesn't have a blockchain. The hotel industry doesn't have a blockchain. The gold industry doesn't have a blockchain. They're not solving their B2B collaboration problems using the blockchain. All of that stuff seems to be stalled in the pipe. So that was not the revolution we expected.
No, that's fair. Definitely laying the groundwork and the build it and they will come kind of situation. I know we've talked about previously, didn't necessarily unfold. I know you mentioned before there was a bit of a mushrooming out of kind of unexpected negative behavior, right? People selling kind of hot air. I like the joke that, I still have my Dentacoin. I haven't gotten my teeth cleaned with it, but that was something that wasn't launched on the network, right? But they kind of turned that on its head, given that it took an unexpected direction. Maybe we can touch very briefly on some of the positive aspects that you see kind of arising out of that, just in the previous 10 years of Ethereum history.
So that was the first part of the paper, right? The first part of programmable blockchains in context says, okay, large-scale B2B organizations synchronizing their computer systems using the blockchain to do it, that's going to be huge. Okay, great. Second part says, but what about crowdfunding as a starting point? Crowdfunding seems pretty simple. Look, here's a little smart contract that does crowdfunding. We've already shown that you can do crowdfunding on the blockchain. That's how we funded Ethereum. What about crowdfunding using the blockchain? That would be a really good starting point. That, talk about predictive power, right? That turned out to be what everybody did. 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, the entire universe decides that what they're doing is tokenized crowdfunding on Ethereum, and Ethereum becomes essentially a crowdfunding platform year after year after year after year, ICO after ICO after ICO after ICO. So we didn't get the large institutions working together over the blockchain, but what we did get was this unbelievable explosive growth in crowdfunding.
And that definitely seems to be something comparatively exciting. Just from my perspective, thinking about leveraging like the wisdom of the masses, right? It's like, yeah, you're not having large institutions and incumbents utilizing the blockchain, but you are having some social awareness spread, for better or worse, kind of through this configuration. And one thing you wrote about in your piece that I found really interesting, that I'm really curious, as someone who's non-technical, your perspective on this. You wrote that smart contracts would eventually be simpler than modern JavaScript. I'm really curious in terms of how you have seen that experience evolve, because as someone who participated in some ICOs, it was comparatively simple, right? It was easy to just send over crypto, receive token. I'm really curious how you've seen the actual developer experience evolving as well for Ethereum just over the last 10 years.
Yeah, so this, I think, was a nightmarish miscalculation. If there is a single mistake I think the foundation made, it was the idea that smart contracts were going to be an accessible tool for ordinary programmers to use. Because it turns out that ordinary programmers are well geared up for the website is down, and they're really poorly geared up for the satellites falling out of the sky. You know, if you think of the amount of damage that a smart contract bug can do financially, it's so enormous compared to the normal kinds of damage that you could get from a JavaScript bug. So, you know, what we've seen is basically the wrong kinds of programmers using the wrong kinds of paradigms, developing buggy software with gigantic value propositions attached to it, resulting in these catastrophic failures on the hacks. And that, I think, is really, really bad. Like, we just really hadn't understood that what we were really talking about is like, look, this stuff is kind of like air traffic controller software. It's really technical. It's really skilled. The programming languages are kind of inaccessible. They're great for doing formal verification. They're really well set up for theorem provers. You know, you can write reliable software with, you know, like we should have pitched the tooling as you need a PhD to use it. The end result is extremely high quality and extremely predictable. The theorem prover rails are coming along really nicely. And by like 2020, it should have been impossible to deploy a smart contract with a bug because everything went over theorem provers. And we did not build that. And frankly, neither did anybody else. You know, the industry is not dominated by formal verification. And frankly, that is because we're stupid. Like, that is just, my God, what is the point in writing smart contracts in a way where you can have a human make an error? It should all be formally verified by now, and we just haven't built the tooling. Can we get in a little bit of a rabbit hole there?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I'm probably your biggest fan of the rabbit holes. So
rabbit holes, right? So, how familiar are you with this concept of Turing completeness?
I'm tentatively familiar. I know you're probably much more than I am. I'm sure someone in the audience would definitely have some inquiries there. So would love a very brief kind of primer before we jump down full force in the rabbit hole.
All right. So Turing complete goes back to a guy called Alan Turing that built the hardware that was used to crack the German codes that the Germans were using to protect their armies in World War II. And Turing and the guys at Bletchley Park cracked those codes and invented a lot of modern computing stuff in the process. And that was instrumental in winning the war. So Turing completeness is like, it's in the same category as like the team at Los Alamos that made nuclear weapons. It's the same kind of high-level military innovation with which one can win wars. So a Turing-complete programming language is a language which can do anything, right? If you could think of it, you can make it do that, off you go. Non-Turing-complete systems are limited, usually because they don't have any loops in them. So a Turing-complete thing could go around and around forever processing data and making changes and decisions and so on. A non-Turing-complete system is kind of like a pachinko ball where it falls from the top and it kind of rattles down the system and it can go down a variety of paths, but it always stops at the bottom and it will take a predictable amount of time to stop. This is a huge oversimplification, but generally speaking, that's kind of how it works. So the problem with non-Turing complete systems is they are nearly impossible to debug. They're really, really hard to debug. And Ethereum smart contracts are in this weird domain where they are Turing complete apart from the fact that there's a gas limit. So the limit is that you have a programming language which is Turing complete, but then you have it running on a virtual machine that eventually imposes a stop because of gas. And at that point, it should have been possible to build formal verification tools for Solidity, or more properly for the EVM bytecode. But in practice, those efforts were never put front and central because we were kind of pitching to an audience that didn't really understand Turing completeness was important, that didn't understand formal verification was important. And formal verification in this context is basically you just keep unrolling the loops, right? You unroll the loops, you unroll the recursion, you just build an enormous graph of the possible execution pathways in the program, and the perimeter of that graph is the gas limit. So you just keep unrolling all the potential execution pathways until you hit the gas limit. Every time there's an if statement, you take both branches of the if, you build an enormous graph, and then you just crop the graph at the limit of the gas. And then you can do, you can run basically graph algorithm analysis on that to figure out whether you have bugs, right? It's not rocket surgery. And I mean, how much has been hacked out of Ethereum smart contracts over the years?
Tens of billions. I mean, just recently the Bybit hack was 1.5 billion.
Yeah, right. So at that point, the fact that we weren't able to organize ourselves to build a formal verification workbench for the EVM so that you could absolutely guaranteeably never ship buggy code again. These are the kinds of things where I kind of point the finger at the Ethereum Foundation, being like, well, if that wasn't your job, whose job was it? That kind of stuff, right? So, those questions about what was the foundation for, and what was the foundation meant to the market, the question about public goods on Ethereum, all of that stuff. I think 10 years in is a great time to take stock on those questions.
No, absolutely. And that's a super interesting proposition, because as someone who's non-technical, I've never really kind of thought about it from that angle. Naturally, there is the star on the lapel of an audited smart contract, but I'm assuming that this would be kind of the approach that some of these auditing firms would be taking, right? Or is it mostly just kind of penetration testing and seeing like, well, where could some failures be? We couldn't really find any. Okay, you're good, rather than actually unrolling the entire thing as you're outlining here.
I am not sure that anybody is doing formal verification of Ethereum contracts. I've not seen anybody offering that as a service. I'm just Googling it right now.
If anyone listening is out there, that's the next era for the next 10 years, the formal verification. That's a powerful.
So there's something on the Ethereum blog written March 21st. Just a quick rundown discussing how it would work. Core logic, technique, symbolic execution. See lots of discussion of it. I don't know if there's tooling. Is there tooling, program verifiers? Yeah, so I mean, I'm just going to drop this into the chat here. So if you guys want to tweet that out, if anybody's interested in formal verification, there's the current state of the art.
Nice.
So that looks like it's a little further along than I thought it was, which is nice to see.
Most definitely. Maybe third-party auditing will be a thing in the past, and we'll have this workbench that we're discussing here. And I mean, that kind of folds us nicely into the current paradigm we're in now, right? So the last 10 years have been kind of fits and starts. We've had some great kind of social exposure of Ethereum, via ICOs, DeFi, NFT, for better or worse, to kind of a larger retail population. And institutions have, for better or worse, largely seen these sorts of innovations as interesting on one hand, or potentially encouraging, all the way on the other side of the spectrum to downright useless and potentially dangerous, which I think there's kind of some truth is somewhere in the middle, right? Kind of a twofold question here for you, Vinay. I'm curious, do you think that the DeFi summer, NFT mania, all of that, do you think those were primarily distractions from the core vision, or do you think they were maybe necessary to get kind of that social percolation of what was possible with the technology into like a wider context to then maybe set the stage for where we're at today?
Yeah. So late 2014, I did a talk for the Ethereum Foundation at DevCon 0 called How to Sell Ideas. And what that basically said is, like, right now there are about 5,000 people in the world that really understand that Ethereum exists, and there are about 50 people in the world that understand what Ethereum is. Right? So between now and mass adoption, you're going to have basically 6 orders of magnitude of growth in the number of people that understand it. If you've got 50 people in the world that understand it now, by the time you've got 5 million people that understand it, that is a sort of 10,000 to 1 growth, 100,000 to 1 growth. Right? So that 100,000 to 1 growth, 3 100x jumps. Right? And what happens when you get 100x jump is you get, like you can imagine, you're standing in a field with 12 people, and then 1,200 people arrive, and everybody then discusses what they're doing in the field. Are you one of the original 12? Do you understand how this works? Yeah, no, but I once met one of the original 12. What did they say? Well, they said it's kind of like a world computer. Oh, I thought it was like Bitcoin with some kind of conditional execution clause. Yeah, well, it's kind of like that too. And so what you get is this enormous game of Chinese whispers. And then in that enormous game of Chinese whispers, all of the people, like the bastards from the multi-level marketing world, arrive. And what we get is professional scam explainers who arrive and start explaining how Dentacoin is going to make $1 trillion for everybody that buys it. And you've got, like the Ethereum team sitting in the corners like, do we have an opinion on that? I mean, all users are good users, right? Is that our business? No, probably not, actually. I mean, we just provide public infrastructure. We're not here to police who does what with it. wow, his suit is really, really shiny and kind of well tailored. He sounds really authoritative. And so pretty soon what happened was that the values of the original team were completely diluted out, right? If you think of like the NFT world, inside of the NFT world, had anybody heard of Vitalik?
That's a really good point. No, I mean, if they're here for the art, and people think the founder of McDonald's is John McDonald, not Ray Kroc, right?
You see what I'm saying, right? So this problem of nobody understood what the tools they were using were, they were just building applications with them. Is that a problem, right? How does the internet work? I don't know, some guys invented it. What are you doing with it? Oh, well, we've an app and you can use it to buy and sell airline tickets. Okay, wow, right? And so in a sense, victory was becoming invisible. Nobody cares how the platform works. They only care about the applications they're running on, and the application communities were completely separate from the platform engineering activity, right? If you were a .com guy in San Francisco in 2005, right, 8, there you are with your app, you're doing great, everything's fantastic. You're not paying any attention to the Internet Engineering Task Force, and you got no idea who Vint Cerf was. So it's not that the original team's values kind of being washed out by their users was a bad thing, but then when we kind of get to the philosophical question of what is Ethereum and what is it for, the absence of answers kind of is, well, the application tier people don't have any of the underlying story. And then on the underlying story, the political vision was probably only held by 5 or 10 people, right? The Ethereum political view, most of the programmers working on it didn't give a monkey's. So, the dilution is a very, very powerful thing. It's a symptom of success, but nonetheless, it is a symptom.
No, absolutely. And it's so interesting because it does remind me a bit of kind of the evolution of language, right? Where the words will rhyme and have similar kind of syntax and context, but they obviously will not be the same word at all. And so that does kind of, for me, Vinay, beg the question of the fact that, throughout DeFi summer, FT mania, the ideas of decentralization and ownership, those were still kind of core components of the conversation, albeit perhaps not to the degree that, the original architects of the Ethereum network originally intended. So it does kind of beg the question for me, right? The values, while diluted or augmented in some way, still seem to have at least their core shape or their core syntax, if we can run with the language analogy. Where does that land us here at present day? Because we've talked a great bit about kind of the past 10 years for Ethereum, the values and the configurations. Now we're really finding ourselves at a really unique place, right? Like as the head of research at RWA World, I'm enamored with asset tokenization, and we're seeing more and more of these assets come on chains. But what does that mean for today when we have this kind of potential augmentation of the values, now that we're seeing big incumbents finally come in and kind of fulfill that original vision of businesses using the blockchain?
Wow, it's hard. I mean, I'm thinking here of Trump coin. Like, thank God Trump coin was issued on Solana. Can you imagine if Trump coin had been issued on Ethereum? How would I feel about my role in having helped to create Trump coin?
That's
and again, let's separate out Trump coin from Trump, right? There is Trump. He's a politician. He's doing the politician thing. I could give you reasons why Trump is better or worse than any politician we've seen in the last 30 years. He's worse than X for this reason. He's better than X for that reason. They're all kind of a mixed bag, right? The American presidency is basically a job for some kind of Sith Lord, and we have the succession of different Sith Lords in that job, right? Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump? Oh, I don't know. Obama or Donald Trump? Well, it depends which way you're leaning, right? I'm not arguing that Donald Trump is better or worse than any other American president. But Trump coin is, by the historical standards of the American presidency, one of the most batshit insane things that an American president has ever stood beside. Right? It's the official presidential Ponzi scheme. Wow, that's amazing. Is that going to become a new thing like 4th of July? Well, I don't know. Let's see what happens with the next president. Vance has become elected. Oh, that's very impressive, isn't it? Is there going to be a Vance coin? Well, I don't know. Maybe it becomes traditional that you have a Ponzi scheme right before you become president. So, I'm very glad that all that stuff is on Solana. I don't have to think about it, right? Not my circus, not my monkeys. Have a nice day. I don't feel morally tied to that. But then you look at like BlackRock, And it's like, oh, BlackRock's doing stuff on Ethereum. Is it now? Yeah, absolutely. And nothing says decentralized crypto assets, like $10 trillion of hedge fund run by a collective of the shadiest people that ever touched finance. Decentralized, did you say? And at that point, you kind of have to check your credentials and think like, am I still a cypherpunk? Am I on the right side of the justice here, or did I just slip over and become just another middle-aged sellout? And that is a really hard question, right? Is the price of success that you automatically find yourself on the side of the incumbency, or is it possible to be a better generation of incumbents than the previous generation? But I sort of feel like we're in a position where it's very hard to imagine success doesn't involve some degree of selling out. But then how far is too far? And what do we do with the crypto anarchist fringe? Like DarkFi, Amir Taki?
I'm not familiar with that.
You haven't come across Amir. So Amir is probably the most dangerous man in crypto, right? I mean, I met him a couple of times in London back in the day, and he is literally the Che Guevara of crypto, right? I mean, he has been in armed rebellions that involved actual war stuff going on, and he's a really serious dude, right? And Amir is out there attempting to rebuild all the DeFi primitives on a fully kind of ZK EVM type basis, so that the entire thing is hardened on from the very bones up. And that just screams to me you're going to get hit with the national security ban hammer on that. But this is our kind of thing of you've got Trump coin on Solana at one end, BlackRock on Ethereum in the middle, and then all the crypto anarchy stuff has kind of gone out to this DarkFi thing. And so you find yourself looking at that, wondering whether what we're seeing is the same technology comes in a variety of different political and ideological flavors. Same code, multiple different rule sets. If only I had a spare professor of political science to come and have a think about that with me, because I think it's super important, but I just don't have the conceptual toolkit to really represent it clearly.
That's definitely something we'll have to double click on. I think after the recording, Vinay, because that's actually my background academically is political philosophy and history. So this is something that's super interesting to me. The differentiation between how you can use the same toolkits, like the power apparatus of the state, to have radically different outcomes relative to its power concentration, stakeholders, etc. That is very interesting. So definitely want to double click on this to varying degrees, especially as we find ourselves kind of at this inflection point, because I think you hit on something really important here, that you can't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, right, in terms of incumbents. And ultimately, if we give the incumbents a type of new rule set, then that can potentially augment their behaviors. But it does beg the question of how do we then solve the chicken and the egg problem of incumbents will never ultimately come to tokenize things without some level of regulatory clarity, because that's the system in which they find themselves. So I'm really curious as to your thoughts in terms of these next 10 years of Ethereum, for example. With the Genius Act and Clarity Acts recently passing in the United States, the cat is out of the bag. We got the thumbs up from Trump in terms of the regulation. Not sure how it's going to affect his meme token that has no backing and is just hot air.
I don't think it's actually directly connected to him anymore. Maybe it was launched by a family member with a license with the Trump name. I don't know.
So someone who knew a guy who knew a guy. I would just have loved to be the fly in the room when he received the brief that surpassed Trump. Could you imagine the dialogue? It's a bird. It's a flightless bird. We're looking into it. We're going to find out what happened. Would have loved to see that. I'm telling you. But I am curious. Do you think this level of state perceived legitimacy, right, from these Clarity and Genius Acts? Maybe we can throw MiCA in there as well from the European side of the equation. Do you think these kind of compliance regimes ultimately help or hinder kind of that vision of decentralization for the Ethereum network? I'm really curious, because it doesn't seem we can get the incumbents without them.
Okay, so if we assume that decentralization is Iranians and Russians exchanging tokens for, let's say, drone parts, it's hard for me to imagine that the global regulatory structure at the national security end of the apparatus is not going to be rather keen on either understanding that or stopping it, right? And while we were dealing with a situation where everybody involved in Ethereum was basically either an academic or a digital monk, we kind of had a class of like scholar programmers that were very materially lightweight. They might own some Bitcoin, they might be rich on paper, but they were still living in Airbnbs in, Saigon and spending 16 hours a day in front of a terminal, right? Mm-hmm. When everybody involved was like that, what we got was basically a kind of like, there was a point in the early 90s when the dominant life form on the internet were librarians. They were sitting in university libraries, they had internet connections. Work was episodic because people would come in once in a while and ask them for something, but most of the time they were sitting at a customer service desk waiting for somebody to show up. And so probably 20 or 30% of the total volume of output on the internet was all from university librarians, because they were the people that had free time in front of an internet terminal, and they were fascinated by tools for accessing knowledge, and they were scholarly. So the internet was for a while a very librarian flavored space, and those were great years on the internet because librarians are very cool. So 10, 15 years ago, we had a domain where it was kind of political libertarian monastic scholars from the kind of interface between probably Asperger's and Ayn Rand. And those kinds of people, when you said decentralization, they weren't up to any kind of serious mischief, so it didn't really matter if there was no watchdog. Mm. There was just a limited amount of damage they were going to do. But now, when you've got frankly criminal regimes that are exchanging hundreds of millions of dollars for arms shipments using crypto, the North Koreans, did they not steal enough money to build a nuclear weapon recently?
Yeah, they were behind the Bybit hack, the Lazarus Group, so they're making quite a pretty penny.
Quite a pretty penny, but that is a lot of money in the hands of very bad people. So at that point, how are we supposed to say that decentralized, end-to-end, permissionless, private, etc., is that really the rule set that those people should be playing by as well? I kind of feel like that might be socially negative overall.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it's giving the form to the Dentacoin folk again, only on a worse scale.
That's it, right? So you wind up with in a position where decentralization cannot necessarily survive the kinds of people that are now using these systems. Mm. And again, that's a worry. And where is that discussion being had? Washington, D.C. has a round of that. The European Union has a round of that. Presumably the Chinese government has a discussion about it. But overall, we don't have something like the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is a global body representing the interests of the industry that is capable of having a sensible discussion with the national security apparatus. Mm. And that is really delicate. I mean, it's a really, really dicey area, because if we're going to wind up regulated into the ground, it's going to be the global security people that do it. Actually, we've had a look at this, and I'm sorry, it's just too freaking dangerous to have this stuff end to end. You're going to have to go and scan your eyeballs with Sam Altman's technology before you're allowed to have a Bitcoin wallet. You see what I'm saying, right?
We pop out at the other side, absolutely. We, instead of engineering something that is comparatively decentralized, we've actually just engineered a digital kind of police state, essentially. And if you want to access any of the fun things, you got to get your eyeballs scanned. So,
and I mean, I've had this conversation with people. Look, the only difference between crypto libertarianism and crypto fascism is whether or not you have to KYC before you're allowed to generate a key. Mm. That's the only difference. And that was true up until the ZK snarks arrived. So then you could imagine a situation where everybody has KYC, AML, CTF, but all the transactions go through snarks, and you can't pull the information back out of the snark without a court order. So at that point, you could wind up with something that is pretty definitively, legalistically fair. Everybody KYC'd at the beginning. Everybody cleared their transactions through snarks. Nobody can see what's going on. But if I come to the snark with a court order, the snark will spit out for me a transaction list for a specific individual. You could just about do it. Issue keys to the Supreme Courts of all the jurisdictions that you're interested in working with, and they can then figure out how to delegate authorities off those keys. Again, it'd be a big job. I'd love to take it on, but those are the kinds of things where you might be able to build an interface between legalistic democratic governance and peer-to-peer transactions. You know, there are ways it could be designed, but it's a serious lift. That's a big job.
No, absolutely. And I do want to get back to the conversation of what the next 10 years of Ethereum holds in terms of its position. But I think you broached a really interesting topic here that I think is very relevant to your work, Vinay. And we have a comment here on Twitter as well, talking about how certain purchases of RWA or real world assets does not necessarily allow you to own a portion of the underlying asset. And I think that's something that's very salient to what you're building at Ethereum. So before we loop back into Ethereum and its next 10 years and its position, I'd really love to kind of double click on what you're working on at Ethereum, because what we're having now at this juncture of assets coming on chain is exactly what we've discussed thus far, right? Businesses are finally doing B2B transactions. We're seeing an inflection point where we have great legitimization of our industry, and finally it feels like, okay, so something is happening. We're getting somewhere in terms of the mass adoption of the underlying technology. But personally, I'm wary of actually buying shares in, let's say, a dentistry that's based out of Iowa, but when I actually drive it through the building, it turns out it's been abandoned since 1995, and the only thing in there is a shopping cart full of various goods that folks who are in the streets like to collect. So my question for you, Vinay, is could you walk us a little bit about the work, walk us through a little bit of the work you're doing at Ethereum and kind of how you're helping to solve for those underlying legal rights and warrants? Because I think that's something that's very understated in our industry, especially with the hype and excitement around tokenized assets. But something that's so crucial to future-proof what we're doing here.
Yeah. So, I mean, on this, at the end of the day, a contract is two people sign a piece of paper and then one person gives the other person money in exchange for the promise of future goods or services. And that structure is really, really old. Like, that's been a fair description of what a contract is for, I don't know. I mean, I don't even know what the first signed contract is that we have in the records, but I'm sure it's well over 1,000 years old. Could be 2,000 or 3,000. Sumerian, probably.
I think actually it does date back to Sumeria. It was the delivery of wheat, I believe, at some undescribed date. Those ancient clay cuneiform tablets.
There you go, right? And that notion that like we've got 3,000-year-old contract paperwork. My God, this world, right? So, you get your 3,000-year-old clay tablet. How does that differ from an Ethereum smart contract? We have the text. It's immutable. 3,000 years. Show me an Ethereum contract that will last 3,000 years. You have signatures. You got payment. You got promise. So signatures are now digital signatures. The payment is Ether or USDC or something along those kind of lines. Where does the promise go? Right? Because you can't have an immediate settlement system where like it's an NFT. I put my money into the smart contract and what I get back is ideally a legal license for a piece of intellectual property, or maybe I'm purchasing an artwork and it's got the same rules as digital art, those are all fuzzy, kind of like that, right? But that's essentially a vending machine model. You're not really creating a contract. You're simply exchanging money for goods and it's an immediate transaction. The element of there's a delay and it's a future promise about future behavior is the thing that kind of makes a contract complex. So we're in a position where there is no standardized way of storing the contract for an Ethereum transaction, right? You guys did the transaction. Well, I gave them the money. Where's the paperwork? And there's no standard answer to that question. Right? Now you think, what? But actually, right, you could have had a version of Ethereum where there was a standard parameter that was passed in a transaction that was a pointer to an IPFS folder, and in the IPFS folder, or, do you remember what was it going to be called? Swarm? I think Ethereum was going to have its own version of IPFS. That was something that was on the Foundation roadmap for a while. I don't think it ever happened.
This sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah, there was Ethereum Swarm, and there was a short messaging system that was called, I think, Whisper, maybe. So the things that we thought were going to get built was there was Swarm, there was Whisper, and there was Mist. So Mist was the secure application browser. I think it was Swarm was the large block, and then the short messaging service, I think, was Whisper. None of that really happened in the way that we thought it was going to. I think those projects all got some degree of progress on them. I have a feeling that Swarm is actually still around. I'm trying to remember the name of the programmer that was working on it. I seem to remember he was Hungarian. His name is slipping my mind. I feel terrible about that because I hang out with him when he's in London, but I haven't seen him in a while. So in any case, you have an exchange of money for a promise of services. In our case, we just make a pointer into IPFS, right? Fine. What is an IPFS? A structured network of legal contracts which divide up the risk of the transaction into modules. Different people are attached to each module, and they're the people whose money is underwriting the transaction. So what that allows is for the creation of a modular contract structure. And the reason that works is because you can take a single stream of money going into the smart contract and you can split it out into a set of different slices. So if we want to sign 24 people signing a single contract, even if you use DocuSign, it's going to take 3 weeks to get the last signature on it. But the joy of Ethereum, all the people that need to pre-sign. When everybody has pre-signed, then customers can come in one at a time, buy, and every single one of those people gets paid a slice out of the smart contract. And that as a structure creates essentially a vending machine type relationship between buyers and sellers, but now you could have 24 people in the transaction. And that's game changing because it basically takes 1 or 2 orders of magnitude out of the complexity of executing complex contractual protocols. So if we want to exchange real estate, that's a contractual protocol. It's got many, many different people involved. There's a lot of different paperwork to sign. We modularize that contractual protocol. We break those things out into smart contracts. We then have a payment mechanism where you just slam an enormous slab of cash in at one end, and then the entire contractual protocol operates. Everybody gets paid what they need to get paid. The buyer receives all of the guarantees and the proofs that they require from all the different people involved, and then they walk out with the token, which is the deed to a house. And it's literally just ka-ching, bang, and the entire process runs as an atomic swap. And you sort of think like atomic swap for real estate, that sounds like it ought to be worth something, and indeed I would agree that it should.
Absolutely. And so it's very interesting because it does beg the question for me, and I know we've had this discussion previously, just making the comparison, right, to what they did in the Netherlands. You shared with me a number of months ago, the Netherlands just took all their property data and put it on a computer. They digitized it. Now, they didn't put it on chain, but they did digitize it, thereby making it at least reasonably easy to query from a reputable source. Here in the US, all of the property data is run on a GIS kind of system. Like it's very lumpy, frumpy, and sometimes it's just written on the back of a napkin that Jim sold it to Bob back in 1976. Maybe it was never updated to the county clerk, so it makes it very challenging. I'm curious, Vinay, based on this sounds like a future I would like to live in. It makes things easier, that's for sure, and definitely less fraud prone, you could say. What are some of the primitives that need to be in place in order for this to be viable, right? I'm sort of assuming gold may be easier to have this kind of system than real estate, for example.
Oh, I mean, it's done. It works, right? I mean, like we did our first real estate listing probably 3 years ago. We've done gold bars. We've done fine art. I'm currently working on a project which is a relatively large publicly traded company that has many hundreds or maybe low thousands of units of real estate that they're pushing through this system right now. That's kind of a bit of a game changer because once that's done, it's then possible to look around at the rest of the world and be like, oh, no, we do everything else now. Okay, because, once you've done your first couple of $1 billion of real estate with some kind of license agreement on hanging off the back of it, at that point, the first couple of $1 billion worth of real estate is the hardest. And once that is successfully concluded and we can actually talk about it and show people what we've done, I think everybody will be like, oh my God, you spent 8 years and that was what you were doing? Yes. You did say that's what you were doing. Yes. We didn't really believe it was possible, so we never really quite understood why nothing else seemed to be happening. Yeah, that's because the first billion is the hardest. Right? Because it's a threshold function, right? Once you can show people, look, these 500 people over there bought use of real estate on a commercial basis using the Ethereum blockchain, and this is how their tokens worked. And that same mechanism will work for anything. It requires a pretty substantial demonstrator to break the paradigm from what to whoa. And we're still in a position where, like, for all the tokenization that's happening, people really are still not into the domain where they can imagine that you just do everyday stuff using tokens. Oh, what are we doing? Oh, we're buying a house. How are we doing it? USDC to a deed token. And where does that happen? Oh, well, there's an exchange. Oh, and it does USDC to deed tokens. Yeah. How do we know it works? Well, here's the insurance policies. Here's the warranties. Here's the dispute resolution. Here's, oh, well, my cousin's a lawyer. Could we have a look? Could we have him have a look over this before he does it? And, cousin the lawyer takes a look over it and comes back and is like, well, I mean, it's all there. Obviously, the old system is a little more. Yeah, you'll probably be fine, right? And at that point where your cousin, the lawyer, looks at it and says, "Yeah, that's all right. I think you can do that." And at that point, you wind up with mass adoption in domains like real estate, because everybody is horribly served by the existing real estate mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And I would much rather see a world in which Ethereum dominated real estate than a world in which Ethereum dominated the trading of stocks and bonds, because we've already got electronic trading for stocks and bonds. What I want to see is electronic trading to real estate, because real estate is a mess. We desperately need real estate to get easier and cheaper to deal with. Let's solve some actual human problems here. And the number one problem for most people is, why am I paying 6% on the price of a house? And why is my landlord a bozo if I'm renting? Let's the only other thing we can do that would be higher social value than fixing real estate is fixing healthcare. Mm-hmm. And I'm a magician, but I'm not that good a magician.
No, it seems like real estate's a lower hanging fruit than healthcare. That's for sure. Healthcare is its own Gordian knot to be solved.
I would love it if we could get to healthcare as well. But I'm going to start with the thing that I think I can solve. I'm from a medical family. My father was a doctor and a research scientist in bio, and at some level, it'd be really, really nice if we could do something about medicine. But the level of paradigmatic change that you would have to make to fix medicine, it's just so heavily regulated. Real estate, I think, is a soluble problem now. Medicine, maybe after the AI systems have eaten all of the medical records, all of the scientific papers, and correlated them, and we get a new generation of AI-based medicine, maybe we could start talking about tokenizing that. Because at that point, you could get really good statistical estimates of the probability that various treatments actually work in a way that we currently don't, because the studies aren't large enough. I mean, there's a thing waiting to be done, but I think it's going to take 5 years for the AIs to come through and break medicine, and then we can remake it in a rational form. Real estate, man, we're ready for business now. You could just bang on our door and say, "Hey, could you please tokenize a thing?" We can do that for you. Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
Well, you have to do it yourself, but we can help you get there.
Right. And so it's also the world's largest asset class at 300 trillion, right? And I mean, we were discussing previously the case that occurred recently against the National Realtors Association, saying that 6% flat fee was considered a monopoly. And so that's something when you hear there's the trust was busted, as happened back in the early 1900s, right? It was a monopoly. So it's a very interesting thing to see that kind of shifting. And so that's, I got to say, just from this conversation, Vinay, 1 hour, we already got two major pieces you and I have to co-author. We got to do the political science one regarding the crypto fascism and anarchism. And we got to do the from what to the breakdown of what it takes to get there for the mind of the average person. So there's two pieces right there.
Why shouldn't we solve these problems, right? I mean, there's nothing about this that says that it has to be hard. When we get down to these questions about the political science of the blockchain and how all those pieces work, that doesn't have to be nightmarishly complex. That's just a thing where we can sit down and we can figure it out.
Right. Absolutely.
It's not like we have to invent the political science from scratch. Pre-existing political theory ought to be able to cover almost all of this. It's just almost nobody's done the work, because the entire political landscape on the blockchain got centralized by the Randroids. And so libertarianism became the official operating system of the blockchain. But, libertarian markets are supposed to be no force, no fraud, and the blockchain is nothing but bloody fraud. Even that hasn't been solved yet. Come on, guys.
Absolutely. And as my friend Boris said, if your entire modus operandi is to come in here and dunk on retail, then he said it in a way that you can kindly F off. You can kindly not be here, because that's not the kind of thing that this technology is made for. But not only is it not what it's made for, but it's not the best application of it. It's like having a hammer where, guys, this is really great. We can drive nails. And then you go and you start hitting a cat with it. Terrible. That's not what it's for. You're doing it completely wrong. Yes, you can use it for that, but one, no. Two, why? And three, it's just a poor application in general compared to its optimal utility, which does make a question, actually. And I really want to kind of circle back to the Ethereum question, because I know we're coming up on time here, and I'm really curious because you've been closer to the fire than anyone. And the work you're doing at Ethereum is phenomenal for ushering in this next 10 years with a clear rights and warrants for the underlying asset. Do you see Ethereum remaining the predominant smart contract network for the next 10 years? I know we've dogged on Solana and the fact that Trump is indeed found his home there with his meme coin. But do you think maybe the fact that Solana is a little bit faster, it kind of makes more sense for people to be able to issue their own funny little tokens? Do you think that could supplant Ethereum as the dominant smart contract network?
No, but, right? So here, I'm going to do the classic thing of opening up the largest can of worms in the entire game 5 minutes before the end of the call. Aha! Everybody fundamentally misunderstands what Ethereum is good at, right? Ethereum is a plug-in replacement for DNS, right? When you process a transaction on Ethereum, the process that you're doing is not that different from buying a domain name. You pay money for listing in a permanent public database that will be there until the end of time, and it will be globally replicated across a network of computers. Right? We do not need to put purchases of candy bars on that basis. Right? We just don't. So the big problem we have is that Ethereum is not great at transactions. Like, the mechanism is fantastic for storing the existence of an object. This is 100 acres from Montana. It has been there for 2.5 billion years. It's going to be there for another 7 billion years. That's our property. That is a great thing to put on a permanent globally replicated database. There is the property. Which specific humanoid has the right to live in the third apartment on the fourth building on the second quad of the fourth tier of the third piece of real estate in building 6? Who that is, that changes all the time. So why do we need a permanent global record of who was ever there forever, right? So what we kind of need is a sliding window of the current things which are important against the fundamentally permanent backing rail. The fact that an asset exists should go on the Ethereum main chain. Who is currently in an asset and who owns equity in an asset and what is represented by the asset and all the rest of that stuff ought to be essentially in a cache, which is a time-expiring L2 structure, right? So the L2s are basically caches of the current status of the mutable transactions. Once in a while, you might have to do a write back before you do something like remortgaging something. But for the most part, Ethereum L1 chain space should be for the fact that the real estate exists. And then the L2s should be for things like rentals and leases and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And maybe a mortgage is big enough that you put it in the L1. But the distinction between the L1 and the L2s should be between permanence and transience. And right now, we don't have an explicit understanding that the L2 is a cache of the L1. So L2's fast and transient, L1's permanent structure. We've never really gotten clear about the semantics of the difference between the L1 asset register, asset identity, and the L2 asset ownership, asset fractionalization, asset tokenization. It's a semantic split that nobody's cleanly made yet.
No, absolutely. I think that's a powerful thought to close out with. The reason being, the next 10 years will kind of identify where Ethereum slots in as the world computer, whether that is that sliding time window and how these caches or L2s will ultimately define what it is and how it interacts with that kind of base layer. Maybe Solana becomes an L2. We shall see. But that's definitely a conversation for another time for sure, a future convo. But Vinay, this has been an absolute pleasure. It's always so much fun to chat with you, and I'm glad we can finally do it on a live stream. Definitely looking forward to doing this again in the very near future. And let's you and I get to work on that kind of political science layout of what the potential future may look like.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun. Well, next call. Love seeing you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody. Take care. Just going to pop in for like 8 seconds and say goodbye. Be sure to follow Ray and Vinay. We'll catch you guys all in the next one. Guys, appreciate you guys coming on. And dropping all the expertise. So I was just in the background listening.
Hey, always a pleasure, my friend. Love what you guys are doing at Wolf, and yeah, let's keep rocking and rolling. Let's keep building.
Let's get it.
We'll soon.
Take care. And
I'm going to leave this thing running.